On June 28th, 1974, my grandfather, my grandmother, and my aunt were driving along this street. They stopped at this traffic light. A car
تم اغتيال وزير خارجية اليمن السابق السيد محمد نعمان.
قلت له لا تذهب إلى بيروت. قال لي تعال إلى بيروت. قلت لا، أنا لا أريد أعود في صندوق.
Murder in Beirut of former Yemen Arab Republic foreign minister and presidential advisor Mohammed Nouman has created profound shock.
ما حدش سمع أصلاً إن في رصاص لأنه المسدس كان كاتم للصوت.
I think if Muhammad had lived another 20, 30 years, Yemen would have been a totally different country.
5 bullets were fired from this car that landed in my grandfather's chest.
He was exceptional. Why to leave him alive?
My grandfather's life was ended when he was only 41. I often wonder what our lives would be like if the bullets had missed his heart. And I wonder if the man who pulled the trigger knew what he would be stealing from my family.
مرح متفتح بنتكلم بيحفز تفكيرك وكيف نمط تفكيرك وكيف نمط اختلافك حتى كيف تختلفي مع الآخرين.
ما تقتلش مشاعرك.
من الذي كان يرعى الأسرة كلها؟ محمد أحمد نعمان الأب. من كان يرتب للأب كثيرا من أمور حياتها؟ الأب.
To understand the circumstances surrounding my grandfather's death, we need to peer back into history and look at the events that led up to it. In the 1960s, Yemen was 2 countries, north and south. The kingdom in the north was ruled by religious leaders known as imams, who went to great lengths to isolate Yemen from the rest of the world. But in 1962, the kingdom ended, and in its place, the only republic in the Arabian Peninsula was established. 5 years later, the South gained independence from Britain and became the only Marxist state in the Arab world. My family played a role in the events that took place in the North, none more so than the man who shaped my grandfather's politics, his own father.
He was probably one of Yemen's best-known political reformers from the 1930s, and he advocated for modernization, modern schools, economic development, and importantly, the rule of law. He was always skeptical of the military.
Cynthia met my great-grandfather a decade after his son's death.
He was still greatly mourning his beloved firstborn, who I think he felt would be his political heir.
For many years, I've wanted to understand the events that led to the assassination of my grandfather, North Yemen's former foreign minister, whose life ended before I ever got to meet him. Lebanon was a second home for my family, and it's where my grandfather was assassinated. It's a stop I had to make to find out more about the man I knew very little about. I'm at the American University of Beirut, where they have audio recordings of my grandfather. I only found out recently that these existed. I'm quite excited about hearing what he sounded like.
أنا بلي مع الأستاذ محمد أحمد نعمان.
متى وكيف علمت بالنشاطات التي يقوم بها والدكم، النشاطات السياسية؟ أول مرة أتنبه للعلاقات السياسية في البلد كانت عندما غادر والدي مدينة تعز إلى عدن.
I'm actually quite surprised. He sounds younger than I had built him in my head. And clearly, I mean, he was young at this point. He was in his late 30s, my age.
والدي عندما قرر الهجرة إلى عدن كنت يومها في 11 من العمر، وقد ترك خطابا للإمام أحمد الذي كان وليا للعهد، وأوصى بأن أتولى تقديم الخطاب. كان هناك عمه، وقد قرر أنه من الأفضل ألا أتولى تقديم الخطاب خشية احتفاظ بي لديه كرهينة، كما هو الحال بالنسبة لمن يتمردون على الدولة. بعد شهرين من سفر والدي توفت الوالدة حيث أصيبت بالتيفود، وفي ظل الخوف والقلق بسبب هرب الوالد الذي فهم أنه نوع من أنواع التمرد أو المعارضة، تقرر أن ننتقل من تعز، وإن كان قد قام في البال أنه لابد وأن نلحق بالوالد. أخي عبد الرحمن، وأذكر أننا اتفقنا في الطريق أن نفتعل حوارا يبعد كثيرا عن أسرتنا حتى لا يسمع أحد ويعرف من نحن ويلقي القبض علينا. قضينا يوما كاملا نسير على الأقدام من قريتنا إلى أن وصلنا الحدود العدنية. كل هذه الصور لا تزال في ذهن الإنسان حتى اليوم.
It seems that those challenging early experiences led to a very driven man who wanted to pave a different path for Yemen, away from authoritarian rule.
He was the most known Yemeni outside Yemen. He's a Yemeni coming from a country that doesn't exist in the minds of journalists.
He made it matter to them.
Yeah. He made Yemen in the spotlight.
A Yemeni diplomat himself, Mustafa understands how different his brother's dream was to Yemen's reality.
Before he left to Beirut and being killed, he was calling, he said, why don't we listen to music, Yemeni traditional music, more than listening to the shots of rifles in the streets? Why shouldn't we just enjoy the music? But nobody wanted to.
We know from American intelligence reports that the US saw my grandfather as a man who wanted to build an independent and united Yemen. But this was an era of high drama. To place the story globally for you, in the early 70s, the world was still polarized by the Cold War. The oil crisis spurred by the Arab-Israeli conflict was fueling tensions between the Arabs and the West.
The embargo, as was previously decided, will continue to apply to the United States and followers.
And the post-colonial era gave way to the rise of Arab nationalism. Amidst all this was Yemen, an impoverished nation weakened by decades of civil war, exacerbated by foreign interference, trying to find its place on the international stage.
Do you think Yemen ever mattered to the outside world?
No. No. We are very important and very crucial because we are next to 12 million barrels a day to Saudi Arabia. And this is why the world is looking into Yemen as part of a Saudi dilemma. It's not because we are Yemen.
And my grandfather knew that, didn't he?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, he had that vision. He knew that Yemen cannot but try to be in peace internally. So we have enough to live in peace. But that didn't work. So all his dreams went
down the drain.
Yeah.
Yemen's history is marred by conflict and turmoil, with only short-lived periods of peace. Those who knew my grandfather say he believed dialogue was the way to fight for change. But I'm also now learning that his tenacity often rubbed people the wrong way.
Do you remember your first impression of him?
I was scared. I was scared of him.
Oh, really? Why?
Because he was such a violent, I mean, not physical, but in his talk, the way he talks, his words, his language. I mean, he was full of revolutionary ideas. We used to call him, and I don't agree with this terminology, al-ghawba. Al-ghawba is when the sky is dark, because so much sand in the air, meaning that late Muhammad, when he comes to a meeting, whatever the topic is, he is going to be the center.
I'm slowly piecing together an image of a determined man who pushed hard for the vision he had for Yemen, despite the trail of enemies he left behind. In a politically volatile region, a Switzerland-like neutral state might sound ideal, but I can't help but wonder if his vision for a newly established republic, still emerging from decades of oppressive and isolating rule, ever stood a chance.
ولكن ظللنا دائما نقول لن نحل المشكلة في بلادنا إلا بأيدينا، فإنهم لن يقووا على استيعاب الصورة اليمنية.
My grandfather talked about Yemenis determining their own fate. But in this very divided era of East versus West, all parties had to choose a side. In ancient times, Yemen was known as Arabia Felix, or Happy Yemen, for the wealth it gained from its fertile land and the famous frankincense trail. But much has changed. During the 20th century, Yemen's neighbors grew rich from oil, while Yemen seemed stuck in power struggles over the little resources it had.
Do you think he disagreed in general with Yemeni culture?
He accepted it as a sick child. What to do with your sick child? You try to cure him or her. That's all you can do. And then this is your mission.
So you think he saw Yemen as his own child?
Of course, because he himself, he lost his mother. He suffered. So he was so concentrated and fully involved in what he's doing since his childhood. And this gives the maturity of the personality when he reaches the 20 or 25 or 30 or 40, then he was assassinated.
2 weeks before my grandfather was assassinated, key events took place in Yemen. This is what I know. June 11, 1974, Mohammed Nouman leaves Yemen on an official trip to Iraq, carrying with him important documents. But first, he makes a stop in Lebanon to see his family. 2 days later, a military coup takes over rule in North Yemen. Colonel Ibrahim al-Hamdi is now president, and my grandfather is no longer in government. Now out of office, my grandfather never makes it to Iraq and instead spends the next week meeting Arab leaders to discuss recent developments. On June 21st, my grandfather returns to Beirut. Retracing my grandfather's steps has brought me closer to him in many ways, and closer to the truth, but I still need to unlock the key moments of his final week.
صباح الخير، كيفك غالية؟ أنا ما انتبهت إنه هو اغتيل بلبنان، بس بما إنه بلبنان فأكيد رح
بالحوادث. Trying to be very, very careful here because these are very old newspapers. I see the mention of his name, whether it's in the coup or other news. And as it's leading up to the 29th of June, 1974, I'm sort of hoping that there's a different ending to this. It's just not realistic.
There's a mention in an article about witnesses who said they couldn't identify the shooters because they fled in a car in the opposite direction. I know the chances of finding witnesses who remember an incident from 50 years ago are very slim. But I'm at the scene of the murder, and incredibly, I find a man who was here that day and witnessed my grandfather's assassination. He doesn't want his face to appear on camera as he's still scarred by the interrogation that followed.
شو شفت؟ قلت له والله 1 2 3 4 هذا اللي حصل معي. كتب شويه اجت البنت اللي انا امنت على الجامعه الامريكانيه، قالت له هذا اللي وقف وسترني وشالني على الجامعه الامريكانيه جايبينه لهون، قام مضاني قال لي الله معك.
But does he remember anyone from that day?
لا ما هي، لا ما هي.
وهي عمتي.
هي اللي كانت معي.
My aunt was in the car with my grandmother and grandfather when the bullets penetrated his body. It's a fact I only found out about recently. This is the first time she's ever spoken to me about it.
ما حدش سمع أصلاً إن في رصاص. أنا ظنيت إنه الزجاج ناثر لسبب ما، لأنه المسدس كان كاتم للصوت، فما حدش أدرك أصلاً إن في حادثة.
شوي بتشفط سياره وبسمع طق 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 بيطلعوا مثل الطيقات بالضبط، فزيت بدي لمه بلاقي حرمه نازله عم تقول قتلونا قتلونا، دخيل الله قتلونا.
لاحظت ان ما حدش جاي يسعفنا، ففتحت الباب ونزلت اتصل بالتليفون للاسعاف.
احترنا شو بدنا نعمل؟ الحرمه على الاسعاف تفضل يا اختي، اخذت التليفون انا اتصلت اول شيء تفضلي احكي.
التليفون ما ردش، فرجعت لقيت السيارة اختفت.
بيمرق شخص شوفير بحط الجريح بالسيارة وبلف وبينزل على الجامعة.
We heard there was an assassination attempt at close by the hospital. The emergency crew brought a person that was covered with blood all over his body, and we were trying to save his life. Finally, we realized it's too late. I didn't even realize who was the person. As soon as I saw the name and looked close to the face, I collapsed.
وصلت للبيت وما كنتش منتبهة إنه فستاني كله كان دم. رحت للبيت لقيت جدي بيتعشى وبيسمع الأخبار. بعد قالوا انتهت الأخبار تانا خبر عاجل.
تم اغتيال وزير خارجية اليمن السابق السيد محمد نعمان.
سكت، ما رفعش راسه ولبس. جاءت له مكالمات كثيرة جدا، ونزلت أنا وهو للمستشفى، فجدي دخل عند الوالد. الوالدة وأنا خارجة بتقول مات، بتصرخ مات مات مات. بس طبعاً جلست مشلولة حوالي 15 يوم.
أوصل إلى باب الشقة، وباب الشقة مفتوح ومطروح ورقة الرجاء عدم رن الجرس. المنزل كله وقوم وصمت وهدوء. ما يقارب 3-4 ساعات ولم أحد يجرؤ أن يعلمني بعملية اغتيال وموت أبي.
I asked them to see him for the last time. Then they withdrew and I covered the face and I kissed him, whispered him, I'll keep always the love. I knew him that he is an icon of love. من يوم ما فاتني وراه شدو البلا بالنواح والورد لونه لون الحجرة.
ضلينا يعني بعدها بسنين بعد عملية الاغتيال لم نصدق أنه رحل عنا. يعني كنا على يقين أنه ما زال حي.
What I really remember very well, my father's smile, as if he wanted to send a message that he will not be broken. He was strong, but I know he suffered until his last days.
He took the edge of the white blanket that was covering his dead son's body and gently lifted it as he stared at a face that had surrendered to the long slumber. Fighting his tears, he turned to his friend and said, "Look at Muhammad as he sleeps. I have never seen him in my life to be so tender and gentle. His mouth shut to words we will never hear from him after today. He is asleep, an eternal sleep." The old man, Ahmed Nouman, uttered these words with strength, pride, and faith. He then replaced the white sheet on his son's sleeping face and left the hospital for his house, where he accepted condolences on the loss of his son, his support, his friend, and companion in struggle, Muhammad.
As I got to know my grandfather, I started to feel his presence and influence on my life. I find myself for brief moments entertaining the idea of what if. And that's when the weight of his loss hits me like a ton of bricks.
I think if Muhammad had lived another 20, 30 years, Yemen would have been a totally different country.
The whole question of political assassinations in the Middle East and the waste that they cause, both kind of at a familial level but also at the national level, is really something that I think we should all be concerned about.
Lebanon in the 60s and 70s was a haven for Arab intellectuals. Its capital was known as Paris of the Middle East, and yet, just around the corner, darkness lurked.
In 5 days, we counted 260 rockets.
A civil war broke out less than a year after my grandfather was killed. Assassinations like his are still prevalent in Lebanon today and remain mostly unsolved.
When you don't have real accountability, it's a cycle, as you say, it will never finish. And I kill, I'm protected.
Rasha Al-Amir is a Lebanese author and sister of Luqman Saleem, a prominent Lebanese journalist who was assassinated last year. His family set up a foundation in his name to help other families find out who is responsible for their loved one's death.
These people were clearly powerful. They had weapons. Why are they threatened by people like your brother and my grandfather who didn't carry weapons?
Because if we had more freedom, people like your grandfather and my brother would have huge influence, and they would change the direction of this Arab world and the world probably. If you have peace in this region and people live intelligent, because now war is not an intelligent point of view, it's not a point of view, it's I kill you and c'est fini and I forget. No accountability, no nothing, you're dead. If you are human, if you are intelligent, you are a danger because you are saying another discourse.
This lack of accountability in political assassinations is making it difficult for me to find any trace of my grandfather's investigation file. There is, however, a small but significant detail that emerged from witnesses I spoke to.
We know that a silencer was used in his killing back in 1974. So what does that tell us about the assassins?
It says that they were not your average mercenaries, that they were highly trained, and silencers, even amongst militias, are hard to find or come by. This says that there might be a state behind this operation, or at least a state-sponsored militia. So this is a sign of how organized and sophisticated this whole thing was.
If my grandfather was executed by a well-trained militia, who then gave the order? During this investigation, I've uncovered many theories, but it always came back to three leading political figures. Ibrahim al-Hamdi is the man who took over the presidency of North Yemen after the military coup that kicked my grandfather's government out of power just 2 weeks before his assassination. On paper, he was the most likely person to point the finger at.
خلفية العلاقة المباشرة نتيجة اختلاف الوسائل واختلاف وجهات النظر ما بين رئيس إبراهيم الحمدي والأستاذ محمد أحمد نعمان.
My grandfather's nephew Lutfi has been asking who killed Mohammed Nu'man since he was 8 years old.
محمد أحمد نعمان كان مقتنعا بأن الجيش للدولة وليست الدولة للجيش.
فكان ضد النظام العسكري.
كان ضد الحكم العسكري عموما.
Military rule was against everything my grandfather had worked for, but he wasn't the type to give up. General al-Maswari is the only Yemeni official from that period who agreed to speak to me on the record about my grandfather's assassination. After al-Hamdi's coup, he was one of the last people to meet with my grandfather.
تذكر ماذا قال لك محمد نعمان في هذه المقابلة؟
كان حزين جدا. أهم كلمة قال كنا نطلع إلى الحكم المدني اللي ناظرنا من أجله. الحكم المدني الديمقراطي وإذا نعود إلى حكم عسكري سيظل 20 سنة. كان سيغير الأوضاع داخليا بأفكاره وعلاقاته الخارجية ويغير من أفكار اللي قبل الانقلاب في 13 يونيو.
To find out what my grandfather did after the coup, I'm going to a university in the south of France where my family archives are held.
There are a lot of archives. So, please.
There are hundreds of old documents here which my father has been helping to sort, but only a fraction have been categorized so far.
I can't work on these archives until they are catalogued and digitalized.
Among these documents are my great-grandfather's diaries. Muhammad's father was very diligent at keeping detailed records. Here I find entries from when Al-Hamdi took over North Yemen. The 17th of June, which is 4 days after the coup, my great-grandfather Ahmed writes, I received a call from the Minister of Interior. He complained in the name of President Ibrahim Al-Hamdi of Muhammad's activities in the media. Now clearly Ibrahim Al-Hamdi was threatened and felt that Muhammad was moving against him in the media where he was really influential. I can see why the motive and the timing make Al-Hamdi a logical suspect. But that theory was quickly dismissed at the time.
Those who hated Ibrahim Al-Hamdi put the blame on him because he was not in good terms with Muhammad.
The US also didn't seem to believe that theory at the time. Al-Hamdi is a popular reforming figure in Yemeni history, and carrying out assassinations were very out of character for him. He came to power in a bloodless coup and ruled North Yemen for 3 years before he himself was assassinated. And like my grandfather and many others, his murder was never resolved and his family never found justice. So if not the most obvious, then who? It's probably helpful at this stage to remind you of an important detail from earlier. 2 weeks before his assassination, my grandfather was meant to go to Iraq to present the president with a confrontational letter, but the coup in Yemen meant he was no longer in office to make that trip. I can't believe I'm holding the letter that my grandfather was carrying with him, the letter that never made it to Iraq. I found this among my family archive. This could be the reason why my grandfather was killed. The letter accuses Iraq of meddling in North Yemen's affairs and threatening its stability. Iraq at the time was ruled by the Arab nationalist Ba'ath Party. In 1974, al-Bakr was the president and Saddam was the vice president, but who was in power?
Saddam was completely in power in 1974.
So why would Saddam Hussein have wanted to kill my grandfather?
If, like we think that the message was being carried to Iraq, then we have to expect that Saddam was trying to intercept the message before it found its way to al-Bakr. And of course, Saddam wouldn't want to kill someone on his own turf because that'll be all on him. So that's what makes Beirut an ideal spot for that crime.
What I don't understand is why would Saddam have the motive to kill him if my grandfather was no longer in power at that point?
One thing you need to always remember about Saddam was that his claim to fame was violence. If anyone threatened him by 0.5 percentage point, he'd take them out.
My grandfather was tasked with delivering this letter with one other colleague. كلفتم بمهمة رسمية لتسليم الرسالة إلى الرئيس العراقي أحمد حسن البكر. ما الأحداث التي حصلت في اليمن التي أدت إلى حمل هذه الرسالة؟
أنا في تقديري كانت نوع من تغطية لما كان سيتم في 13 يوليو في تقديري أنا.
General al-Maswari believes that al-Hamdi and others made up a story about Iraqi meddling to distract from their own coup.
يعني هؤلاء هم الانقلابيون وليس الانقلاب البعض.
The third theory points at the man who ruled South Yemen. My grandfather, who stood on the other side of the socialist ideology, played a key role in several negotiations which the Southerners believed threatened their strategic interests. His involvement in one particular case would later be used against him.
معاهدة الطائف كانت بعد حرب 34 يعني طبعا وقعت الاتفاقية بين اليمن والعربية السعودية.
This border treaty between Saudi Arabia and North Yemen was endorsed by my grandfather almost 40 years later to continue the peace between the two countries.
كان التجديد مسألة شكلية لأن اتفاقية الطائف اتفاقية نهائية.
But endorsing this agreement seemed to anger the southern leaders. They said that they believed that Yemen will one day be united, and as such, any border agreements affected their future as well. Abdullah al-Hajri was another Yemeni politician who endorsed that same agreement. He was shot in a car in London 3 years after my grandfather's assassination. There were speculations that tied the two murders.
هذه كان من الأعذار والمبررات الغاية التفاهة.
Abdel Bari Tahir is one of Yemen's most highly regarded independent journalists. He remembers the events from that period clearly.
هي تغطية للاغتيال لشخصية خطيرة. كان رجل يمتلك ذكاء وعبقرية فذة ونادرة، وكان يبدو هناك ترتيب ما بين اليمن بشطريها، ما بين العراق أيضا، لاغتيال الرجل لأن إحدى العقبات أمام حكم القبيلة والعسكر.
I tried to reach out to Southern officials from the time to find out more about their relationship with my grandfather, but none would agree to an interview.
بس ما حد فيهم رضي إنه يتكلم معي خالص بالموضوع هذا، ليش برأيك؟
المشكل أن كل الأطراف مشتركة، ولما يشتركوا في جرائم من هذا النوع لا أحد يجرؤ على الكلام.
I've exhausted all the leads, but I still can't find evidence to come to a conclusion. There is, however, one person I've yet to find here in Lebanon. But I haven't been able to find a trace of him, which makes me wonder whether he survived the attack. I thought Lebanese newspapers might have followed up after my grandfather's assassination, but despite his murder having made the headlines, I was surprised there was nothing further on any investigation. But curiously, a week after my grandfather's death, a prominent Lebanese journalist and close friend, Michel Abu Jawde, was kidnapped. Michel's articles had huge influence and sway across the region. He was eventually released and immediately after gave this interview.
Did the kidnappers find criticism with your articles that you have written?
Yes, and they were asking me about Mohammed Nouman and so forth.
Michel passed away 30 years ago. I've come to meet his family to ask them what they might know.
تحقيق مع ميشيل من قبل الخاطفين سئل كثير عن موضوع محمد النعمان.
And before he was kidnapped, he was trying to find out who killed him.
أكيد كانوا عارفين شيء. التقوا هيدا النهار أنا ما بنسى بحياتي، التقوا الظهريات حوالي 3 ساعة مع بعضهم بالمكتب، مسكر المكتب، قال لي ممنوع حدا يدق علي. اثنيناتهم ما كانوا مرتاحين. في شيء مبلغ لجدك وفي شيء مبلغ لميشيل حول أوضاع آدمي، والدليل دفعوا الثمن بخلال أسبوع اثنيناتهم.
Michel's family don't believe both incidents are directly linked, but these two liberal Arab men who had regional influence seem to threaten powerful movements across the region.
اللي قتله هو اللي قتل العالم العربي. مقتل جدك، خطف ميشيل، تدمير لبنان، خطة محكمة لإنزال العرب إلى القرون إلى الظلام.
هذا جيل ما بيتكرر. ما بيتكرر.
We know Michel followed up on my grandfather's assassination, but did he leave any clues? His family are giving me access to his old documents.
It's here.
والله لو طلبت مليار.
Oh my God. This is the investigation file investigating my grandfather's assassination in Beirut in 1974. We've been looking for this for months and months and months. We found what we've been looking for, but it doesn't carry many answers. Just more questions. And how did they close this investigation? What was the conclusion? That doesn't seem to be in the file.
I spent hours sifting through old handwritten documents. There were many details that didn't add up to much, and an investigation that seemed to wrap up with no conclusion. But I did find one statement that I've been looking for. Remember the friend who was driving the car when my grandfather was shot? I haven't been able to find him, but here in front of me is his police statement from that day. I found an old address of his, not an exact one, but enough to start searching for him.
We've been driving for a while now trying to find the building. It's a bit difficult with the general darkness in the city. We've found the building where Shaker Nassif used to live. We're not sure if he's still in the country or if he's abroad, but we're trying to find a number for any relative of his.
I spoke with the building manager and explained to him why I was searching for Shaker.
حاول تواصل مع الأستاذ شاكر نصيف.
This is it. The interview I came to Lebanon for, only to find the person I've been searching for all the way in Canada. I'm hoping he will be able to fill the gaps in the story.
وصلني برقية أو تليفون أو شيء من جدك المرحوم محمد، وبيقول لي أنا واصل على طيران الميدل إيست الساعة كذا. تاني يوم طلعت أنا درج الطيارة ونزل، سلمنا عليه وأخذته وطلعت أنا وياه. رحت وصلته على البيت، قلنا له إنه في عزيمة، قال إيه بنروح. طلعت بسيارتي BMW بيضاء، ركبنا بالسيارة ومشينا تقريبا 200 متر. كان يوم الله يرحمه جدي قاعد جنبي وأنا عم بسوق، ستي كانت قاعدة وراه. وصلنا على نقطة في إشارة، ما شفت إلا سيارة قربت، وقفت الشباك على الشباك. الله يرحمه جدك قال لي نار نار نار. نزلت راسي تحت الدركسيون السيارة، لقيت راسي بإيدي، بعدين سمعت عم بقول رصاص وما عدت وعيت أنا.
Shaker was shot several times in his hands and stomach. He survived thanks to the man who rushed the car to the hospital.
بقيت بالمستشفى أنا تقريبا أسبوع، ما عرفت شو صار، لأن إجا لعندي ابن عمي، بقول له لابن عمي دخلك كيف صار الأستاذ محمد؟ قال لي ليش أنت ما عرفت؟ توفي لحظة إطلاق الرصاص لأنه أصيب بالقلب.
It's really hard to ask people to remember such traumatic events, and I'm grateful that he opened up. But he later tells me that his family didn't want him reliving this story.
وكيف جرى التحقيق في عملية الاغتيال بعدها؟
عملية الاغتيال ما صار فيها تحقيق. لا ما صار.
كيف ما حققوا فيها؟
هيك سؤال جواب انتهت الموضوع بهالشكل. بهذيك الأيام ما كان ممكن واحد يعطيه 50 ليرة لبناني يروح يقول له اقتلي 2 هودي 2 اقتلي اياهم وياخذ فرق بقوصهم وبيمشي.
هل تعتقد انه في امل بالنسبة لتحقيقي انا في الوصول الى الحقيقة؟
لا ما بعتقد ابدا. ما اذا شاءت الظروف والايام انه نلتقي، يمكن في شغلات بذكر لك اياها بتشوفي انه الامور كثير متشابكه مع بعضها. 3/4 اللي كانوا على علم بهالموضوع كله مات، ولما بيموت الانسان بيموت كل شيء معه.
To say I feel frustrated is an understatement. I had hoped to get closure, but it feels like the truth has been denied to me and my family.
Our history is full of half-truths, and these gaps in our narrative can be dangerous if we fill them with assumptions instead of facts. So where does this leave families like mine? In an uncomfortable place somewhere between acceptance and defiance. But as for me, my quest for finding out what happened to my grandfather won't end here. Do you think he would have wanted us to know who killed him?
وأكبر ثأر لمقتله هو أن تجدي لأفكاره صدى كبيرا في نفوس الناس وفي عقولهم.
عند أم آسيا أهم درس تعلمتيه من جد محمد؟
الصبر. كان صبور؟
ذكرتيه.
بعد مرور 40 يوما على استشهادك وأنا كبير على البكاء، ولو شئت أن أبكي دمان لبكيته عليك. لقد نقل جثمانك من لبنان لتدفن في اليمن في وطنك الحبيب، ورفعك عاليا ليراك الناس جميعا وليسمعوا صوتك المدوي. الذي ظل ينادي بالحوار وصلى عليك شعبك. وحملك على أكتافه وشيعك إلى مثواك الأخير تشييعا يتكافأ مع حبك له، ففي ذمة الله وفي رحمته ورضوانه. Yeah, it's hard.
حاسة إني بقلب عليكم جوايا.
It's okay. It's okay. It will be fine. الله يعينك. At least we knew him.
discovered is that my grandfather wasn't the kind of man who could easily be sidelined by removing him from power. His influence was far-reaching, and his voice echoed beyond the borders of Yemen. In the end, a bullet was the only way to silence him. I don't know if Yemen's future would have been different had my grandfather lived. But what is certain is that for us, his family, the short life he lived mattered, and his absence is still deeply felt.